many of the anti-aging interventions that people are very interested in are targeting the circadian clock. Access to food is clearly a really big drive health at the appropriate circadian time of day.
Greg, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Siim. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and I'm happy to have you on the show because you gave me this insight that I haven't heard before, which is that the circadian clock dysfunction is probably going to be called a new hallmark of aging in the near future. And when I did some research as well, then I discovered a few papers on the topic as well of linking this circadian clock dysfunction with aging. Now it's something that a lot of people might have intuitively known already before, but it hasn't been worded in that sense so far. So I'm happy to have you as a circadian rhythm expert on the podcast and discuss what is this circadian clock dysfunction that happens with age, and what can we do to prevent that. And maybe we can start with so many people might have an understanding of what are the circadian rhythms and what do they do, but how do they actually relate to aging, and how does this, what could possibly go wrong during aging that it would actually contribute, or it could be characterized as a hallmark of aging?
I think we should probably take a step back first and think about the hallmarks of aging and how those were developed, what they are, and whether we should be thinking through the lens of the hallmarks of aging. So do you mind if I just backtrack and briefly touch on those?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can do that.
I think many listeners will be familiar with what they are, but they were put forward about 15 years ago nearly now. And I think a lot of that was inspired by this Hallmarks of Cancer paper that came out in 2000. And the idea behind them is that these are drivers of aging. And so if that's the case, then if you amplify them, you should be able to accelerate aging. If you dial them down, you should be able to retard aging. And also, one of the ideas is that they're conserved across different organisms. So they might accelerate aging in mice and humans, and roundworms and fruit flies and various different model organisms that are used to assess human aging, recognizing that it's hard to actually work out what's driving aging in people because we live such a long time. So the way that they were first developed was basically just by way of a narrative review. It was a group of scientists with particular interests, and the hallmarks that were proposed largely mapped to the interests of those scientists. And you can kind of trace the hallmarks to the individuals that contributed to the paper. And they're a good first approximation, but we need to bear in mind they weren't identified by any sort of systematic, unbiased process. They've been added to over time. So a few years ago, they were updated and there were 3 more that were added. Others have put forward some other hallmarks, such as changes in the extracellular matrix, changes in RNA splicing. And I mention all of this just because people nowadays are so focused on the hallmarks of aging. And I think many scientists feel that if they're going to get a grant proposal funded, then they have to frame things in the light of the hallmarks of aging. But really, the actual foundations that those are based on are somewhat shaky. So let's just bear that in mind, and also consider that these are biological processes that I think do contribute to aging. And I think the evidence behind some of them is much stronger than others. So the body of evidence supporting the idea that chronic inflammation or genomic instability are drivers of aging is very strong. But for some of the others, I think it's less strong, and some of them are impressively vague too. So one of them being altered intercellular communication, which can span massive timescales. And we could be speaking about communication between cells locally, so paracrine mechanisms, or systemically over longer periods. So that might include hormones. And therefore, I don't actually think that they're all that helpful when it comes to trying to improve aging. And also they have network-like properties. So for the most part, if you address one node in the network, other things will respond to that. Some other
Yeah.
things that we should be considering, I think, include the fact that there are some age-related phenotypic changes that we're all interested in. Some of those are very obvious to the eye: skin wrinkling, loss of hair graying, that type of thing. And some of the model organisms that are used to assess whether interventions influence these hallmarks of aging use models that don't actually recapitulate these types of age-related changes. And trying to translate research from, say, mice to people often doesn't work very well. If you look at mice, for instance, and people will hold up something like the interventions testing program as some sort of gold standard way of identifying whether a nutraceutical or a drug affects aging by looking at lifespan in mice. When it comes to mice, about 70% of their deaths are due to cancer. But in people, if you look at the top 5 causes of mortality, then cancer isn't one of them. So there's that limitation too. So let's not overinterpret the hallmarks of aging, just as a general
Mm.
starting
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. For
And
for me, I'll comment that, yeah, in my opinion, the hallmarks are more like this, the outcome of aging, more like the characteristics of aging that happen due to the aging process. So, as you get older, you see a decline in health due to the aging process. We don't necessarily know what is the cause of aging. Obviously, it's a natural process in of itself. But yeah, the hallmarks are more like the outcomes of what happens during this process. So, like a 80-year-old person, they're generally going to have, worse microbiome, lower autophagy, worse mitochondrial function, higher inflammation, more circadian clock dysfunction, etc., than a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old even. So it's just the natural, more like, yeah, the reflection of aging that happens over the course of decades. And yeah, it's arguable whether or not targeting those hallmarks would, let's say, fix aging, or it's obviously not going to reverse it. It might, let's say, slow it down, because people who have better inflammation, better mitochondrial function in their 80s. You can see a very healthy and fit 80-year-old and a very sick 80-year-old. They probably have huge difference in their mitochondrial function and huge difference in their inflammation status, and even the intracellular this communication as well. So you can probably see that, okay, healthier people tend to have better outcomes when it comes to these hallmarks. Yeah, I agree that it's not the actual, let's say, cause of aging or a driver of aging. Is more like the outcome of the aging process. So I guess it's, something that might improve health span, but it's not going to dramatically reverse aging or make people live to 200 years old.
yeah. And just to add a few more things in the mix. One is that I think each of the hallmarks is probably of varying importance between people and in different tissues. So if you take a very energetically costly tissue, like the brain or the heart, then I would guess that mitochondrial dysfunction might be a relatively more important hallmark than some of the others.
Hmm.
Another is that I do think trying to identify what the drivers of aging are is, of course, very helpful. And the geroscience hypothesis holds that if we can slow the aging process, then we can basically ward off a bunch of age-related diseases at the same time, which I think is a noble goal. But actually trying to disentangle the process of aging from people passing away due to disease is really hard. And I don't honestly think that we've got a good handle on that at the moment. And it could be that a lot of the candidate gerotherapeutics or geroprotectors are actually just primarily affecting some disease processes that are common to several different morbidities. And just as one final comment, I like the fact that the World Health Organization a few years ago put forward the focus on so-called intrinsic capacities as being important to healthy aging. And these capacities include things such as physical strength, cardiorespiratory fitness, cognitive functions, whether that's working memory or attention, so on. And I
Hmm.
realize that preaching to the converted here, Siim, because this is something that you discuss on a regular basis. But I just want to set that background. And so
Hmm.
against that,
Yeah.
I suggested that loss of clock function is a hallmark of aging based on various different premises. And I'll just superficially go over some of these because we can get into the weeds later if you like. One of them is that if you tamper with the clock, then it affects the rate at which organisms seem to age. And often people look at lifespan as a proxy of this. It's not a perfect proxy by any means, but you can tamper with the clock in different ways. So one of those would be endogenously. For example, you can induce manipulations of the genetics of animals. And there's a core clock that exists in all nucleated cells that comprises a feedback loop that produces rhythmic changes in gene expression, hence protein products over the course of a 24-hour day in order to temporarily separate processes. So when to build things, when to break them down, and so on. And you can nullify some of those core clock proteins in animals. And when you do that and you basically knock out clock, which is one of these genes, or BMAL1, it's been done with some others too, then animals do tend to live shorter lives. And they also get some of those age-related phenotypes I mentioned earlier. So in the
Hmm.
case of BMAL1 knockout, you get things like sarcopenia and accelerated hair loss. So
Right.
we've got that type of endogenous disruption. And some of that is relevant to certain people because some people might have mutations of some clock genes that produce unusual circadian phenotypes. So maybe they're very early birds or night owls, for example, or maybe they struggle to entrain to the 24-hour light dark cycle. Another type of endogenous disruption would be someone who has blindness and they don't have functional photoreceptors in the retina. And that means that they can't synchronize their master clock in the brain to the light dark cycle. And so they run free, and it means that they're only actually aligned with the world around the minority of the time, and the rest of the time they're just drifting across the day. And then you also have exogenous disruption to the clock. And so here at the level of the population, we can think about things like shift work, where someone is trying to synchronize their clockwork to a new schedule. And as a result, they're exposed to variations in the light dark cycle when they're eating, when they're fasting, when they're physically active, the time cues that help set their clocks. And that can lead to internal disorganization within the circadian system, which we can think of as being internal misalignment, external misalignment being where your body's clockwork isn't synchronized with the world around you, internal being where the clocks within you aren't all set to the same time because they seem to entrain to different stimuli at different rates. So when we look at humans and some of those forms of circadian disruption, which span quite a large range of how strenuous they are. So at the least strenuous end of the spectrum, we have things like people who live in different parts of the same time zone. And if you look at the epidemiology, then there's some evidence, it's not that strong, but there is a signal that people that live in the west of a time zone have slightly higher rates of cancer than people who live in the east of a time zone, which presumably is because their sleep follows the sun somewhat and they end up losing a little bit of sleep in response to that.
Hmm.
Another example is people who are exposed to artificial light at night, which again seems to associate with cancer. And there's quite a lot of work looking at breast cancer specifically. And some people think that that relates to melatonin.
Mm.
And that has important roles in the circadian system, but obviously has many other effects too, as an antioxidant and so on. And I know that's something that you discussed at length, Siim.
Yeah.
In terms of more strenuous disruption, we can then start to think about the far end of the spectrum, which would be something like regular jet lag. So maybe someone's working as a flight attendant or shift work. And shift work differs hugely in how hard a given schedule is. So some schedules aren't too bad, particularly if they're enforced with consideration of someone's chronotype. whether they're an early bird or a night owl, recognizing that early birds are really going to struggle with a night shift, night owls are really going to struggle with an early morning shift. But shift work can be really hard on the circadian system. And one of the difficulties here is just that we're not just speaking about circadian disruption. If you think about shift workers, there are all sorts of other stresses that come with that. Everything from maintaining relationships with loved ones to financial stress in general. Shift working roles aren't quite so well paid as non-shift working roles, just as an example. And they also tend to have lower quality sleep and sleep slightly less. They also probably abuse alcohol a little bit more and might have slightly less healthy lifestyles in general, which probably relates in part to both the circadian misalignment and the sleep loss. So we need to bear that in mind. But if we look at shift work, then meta-analyses have shown that that associates with increased risk of various different diseases. So everything from some heart diseases to, when I say some heart disease, I mean some cardiovascular diseases, which include stroke, to some problems with mood regulation, so disposition to anxiety and depression, and various different metabolic disorders, such as the metabolic syndrome. And so that is another clue that disrupting the clock is contributing to accelerated aging, some of which is probably driven by this increased risk of chronic disease. The flip side of this is that if you improve clock function, then you should be able to retard aging. And this has been less well studied, but there is some evidence in that direction. I would call it preliminary, but it's certainly intriguing. I realize I've already given quite a long answer, so I'll pause there, Siim, in case there's anything you want to pick up on.
I want to take a quick break to let you know about my favorite wellness devices, which are the bond charge red light therapy devices. You've probably seen many of your favorite longevity influencers using these red light therapy devices, but do they actually work? Yes, they do. Red light therapy has been shown to have many benefits on skin anti-aging, hormone optimization, pain management, and even exercise performance. I use my device every day for 15 minutes, especially during the winter months when there's not much sunlight. It increases my energy in the morning and makes my skin glow. Just check out the testimonials on the Bond Charge website for the before and after pictures of other people. Most red light therapy devices don't have the right wavelengths of light, which might mean you're not getting the claimed benefits. Bond Charge uses the exact wavelengths of light used in research, and they also have near-infrared light that's beneficial to the joints. Head over to bondcharge.com and use the code SIIM, S-I-I-M, for a 15% discount. Maybe we can talk about as well, so these clocks, our body has these different circadian clocks. It's said that each organ and each cell has its own circadian clock that is connected to the master clock inside the brain that is kind of the master coordinator of all these different clocks. And these clocks, they control a lot of different functions in your body related to hormones, body temperature, even physical performance, alertness, sleep cycles, etc. So, and I guess my question is, why do these circadian clocks then affect aging if they become more dysfunctional or worn down? Is it that, like let's say with heart or brain, with age you see the accumulation of plaque and let's say damage to the organ itself that then leads to a higher risk of Alzheimer's and heart disease, etc. But these clocks aren't necessarily like organs. If I understand it correctly, they're not organs per se, but every organ has its own clock. So what does the clock dysfunction do? Does it lead, obviously all the hormones are interconnected, that clock dysfunction increases mitochondrial dysfunction and increases inflammation and all those things are like that. But is there anything specific the clock dysfunction does? So why does a clock dysfunction lead to a higher risk of cancer and heart disease and diabetes?
Well, I think it's what you're alluding to, which is dysregulation of everything that the clock affects. And so there are different ways that you can consider this. But one way would be, for example, to look at certain pathways that the clock influences. So if you look within cells, you've got this transcriptional, translational feedback loop that produces rhythmic changes in certain proteins. And those proteins are transcription factors. Transcription factors are proteins that affect the expression of other genes and therefore their protein products. And so you've got this loop which is producing these fluctuating levels of proteins, but then those are producing fluctuating levels of all sorts of other proteins that then influence everything from inflammation to nutrient sensing and so on. And they do so on a cell by cell basis. So we're speaking about an emergent phenomenon, something that begins at the level of the cell, actually probably a smaller level than that, and then has these cascading effects influencing biology at large. And so we could speak about specific examples, like if you're talking about some of the genes that have been implicated in accelerating aging. And so those would include mTOR, for instance, and insulin like growth factor 1, then the clock affects the expression of those genes. And so it could be that it's causing dysregulation of when those are turned on and when those are turned off. And then over time, that's contributing to issues. If you think about some putatively anti-aging genes, which might include things like FOXO and AMPK and SIR2 and 1, then again, that transcriptional translational feedback loop is affecting the levels of those proteins too. And interestingly, in both instances, many of those feed back into the clock. And so you can either have a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle. But the flip side of that is what I mentioned earlier, and that is that if you improve the function of some of those molecular clocks, then you might be able to ward off aging. And I realized that one thing I didn't mention earlier, Siim, that you asked about initially, is some of those age-related changes in the clock. And we see that across many different levels of organization. So it could be that you're looking at individual cells and those gene expression profiles, and you can see a reduced amplitude of the expression levels of certain genes over the course of the day. But also we see that at the level of physiology. So many hormones have dampened rhythms during aging, like melatonin, but others too. And then in terms of things like core body temperature, which affects all sorts of things, including physical function and rest activity rhythm. So when people are awake and when they're asleep. And I think a lot of this ultimately is driven by some of those molecular changes that I mentioned, but clearly trying to disentangle exactly what's causing what is enormously complicated, because we're talking about the effects of the interactions of these tiny clocks and cells throughout your body. And so I recognized in some ways my answer is probably quite unsatisfactory, but I think that's the reality of it.
Yeah, that's true. And you mentioned the melatonin levels decline with age. So is this like the outcome of this circadian clock dysfunction that happens during age? Because older people they see this flatlining of a lot of these hormones like cortisol and melatonin, so they don't have this big amplitude. Is this then the main outcome of circadian clock dysfunction?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's the main outcome, but I do think that it's a product of dysfunction in some of the organs that are producing those hormones. And then that dysfunction is driven by some of those molecular changes that I mentioned. So in the case of melatonin, most melatonin is produced by the pineal gland in the brain. In the case of cortisol, we're speaking mostly about the adrenal cortex. And so really, I think some of that reflects what's going on within those specific tissues. And something that we're learning is that organs seem to age at different rates. Again, there are all sorts of issues that are tied up within that. But if that's the case, then it could be that someone who has accelerated aging within the adrenal glands might experience greater dysregulation of levels of some corticosteroids, for instance, whereas maybe their adipose tissue is aging at a slower rate and they have less dysregulation of some adipokines and adipose-derived hormones like leptin and so on. So again, I don't know if that's satisfactory, but
what things then promote this circadian clock dysfunction. Part of it is natural aging. We don't know the background mechanism of aging, the kind of root cause of aging. Um, but I would imagine things like bad lifestyle, obesity, you mentioned jet lag, circadian disruption, shift work, etc. They all speed up the deterioration of these clocks, and living a more circadian aligned lifestyle that, following the natural day and night cycles and not having a lot of artificial light at night, those would presumably maintain this clock function for longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can look now to experimental studies where people have manipulated some of those time cues that help set those clocks. The main ones being the light dark cycle for the master clock in the brain. Nutrition is probably something of a time cue for many of the peripheral clocks outside of that central clock, in particular clocks that are involved in things like digestion and metabolism. So think about the gut and the liver and pancreas and some of those tissues. And then physical activity, which does seem to affect the timing of the master clock in the brain a little bit, but it's probably relatively more important for some of the clocks that are contributing to function in relevant tasks, like skeletal muscles and bone tissue and so on. And what we see in experimental misalignment studies where there's a behavioral cycle that's enforced that people can't synchronize their clocks to. So often these studies will use something called forced desynchrony, which might entail a 28-hour day, and the human circadian system can't adapt to that. 4-hour deviation from 24 hours is just too much. And so within about 3 of these cycles, 28, 28, 28, people are now awake and eating and active at precisely the time when their clocks are promoting rest and sleep and recovery. And within those studies, very quickly, all sorts of things go wrong. So you see everything from disruption to various different hormone rhythms, changes in the relationships between their phases, to change in cardiovascular function. A lot of people who are previously normoglycemics, had good blood sugar control, temporarily become pre-diabetic. And the effects seem to accumulate. So there hasn't been much long-term research on this type of experimental paradigm because it's just so hard for people to stick to. But there is some evidence that the negative effects do accumulate, and then you start to see some markers of actual organ dysfunction relatively quickly. And so some of the circadian dysfunction that we're seeing with age, I think, is actually a product of cumulative disruption to the circadian system because of irregular time cue exposures. And that could be irregular light dark cycles, irregular meal timing, irregular physical activity timing. There are probably some other things that do affect some of those clocks too. Certainly, I think some medications do. And given that food does, some of the substances within food likely do as well. And interestingly, some of the candidate gerotherapeutics, while most haven't been studied in this context, do seem to affect the molecular clock. So a good early example of this is the polyamines, spermidine being one of those, and something that many people are interested in nowadays. Some of the early work showed that as mice age, you see characteristic change in their rest activity rhythms. In the case of mice, their rest activity cycles actually lengthen, whereas in the case of humans, they tend to shorten. That's why we become earlier and earlier birds as we get older. And the mice also have characteristic changes in the rhythms of polyamines, spermidine, spermine, and putrescine in the blood. When you supplement them with polyamines like spermidine, you restore the normal levels of those in the blood and their normal daily variation, but also their rest activity rhythms tend to shorten. And so they look more and more like young mice. And so given that John Hoganesh was the first person to show this, it seems that the huge majority, over 80% of FDA-approved drugs, have targets that are regulated by the circadian system. Many of the anti-aging interventions that people are very interested in, this is certainly true of calorie restriction, but it's probably also true of some drugs and supplements are targeting the circadian clock. It's just that they actually haven't been studied in that context.
Mm.
Only a few have, and spermidine is one of those.
I've seen that restoring NAD metabolism with calorie restriction helps to maintain circadian clock function as well in humans. So obviously, calorie restriction has a lot of different pathways it activates and affects. Uh, Maybe NAD metabolism is also a key component here, as it is regulated by circadian rhythms, and it also contributes to circadian rhythm function. So yeah, maybe these NAD supplements in the future will be also investigated here.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good example. So calorie restriction, it does actually seem to normalize a bunch of age-related changes in biological rhythms. And I think NAD is a player there. So NAMPT, which is the rate-limiting enzyme in NAD biosynthesis, is clock regulated. It's regulated by the positive arm of the molecular clock. And then that in turn influences various other proteins that are thought to be involved in aging, like Saturn1. And Saturn1 then feeds back into the clock. So it could be that some ways of targeting NAD, which so many people are so interested in, whether it's supplementing NR or NMN, whatever it might be, are actually affecting clock function. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we see that over time. Calorie restriction, I think, is really interesting for lots of reasons, though. And one of them is that is the first experimental intervention that people shone a light on as being a way of extending lifespan in other animals. We've known that for over a century now. When you actually look at the experiments, what wasn't done for the most part was to assess when animals consume their food. And we know from superb research by Joe Takahashi and his colleagues from the last few years that when you enforce calorie restriction, animals self-impose time restriction. So if mice have access to a limited amount of food each 24 hours, they consume it all within 2 hours or so. And so many of those calorie restriction experiments are actually probably confounded by time restriction. And it could be that time restriction is meaningfully contributing to some of the benefits that you see in those studies. And Takahashi and his student, Victoria Acosta Rodriguez, did this great study that came out in Science 3 years ago, where they looked at various different permutations of calorie restriction in conjunction with time restriction. And they found that calorie restriction alone could extend lifespan by about 10% in the usual C57 black 6 male mice. But when that was combined with time restriction, such that they were consuming their food during the early portion of their active phase, so the early portion of the night because they're nocturnal, their lifespan could be extended by over 30%. It's more like 35%. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing in those calorie restriction studies in non-human animals is actually a function of improvement in circadian function. And sure enough, when they looked under the hood, they found that many of the changes in gene expression that occurred during age became normalized. And so, whereas in the ad libitum fed mice, they saw increased markers of inflammation and some reductions in expressions of genes that are thought to have anti-aging properties, those were largely reversed by the addition of time restriction. So I think improvement in circadian function actually underlies many of the benefits that we've seen from some of the better accepted anti-aging interventions. It's just that it's only now that people are starting to look at that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, it makes sense. Or I would also predict that, let's say, even if you are calorie restricted, but you eat at the wrong time, then you might be getting, some benefits, but they're probably smaller than if you were to be eating at the right time, which, for humans would be during the daytime. For mice, it's the nighttime, but for humans, we are supposed to eat during the biological daytime and not really eat in the middle of the night.
Yeah. And I think that's largely true. I think energy balance is such a big driver of health. And there are certainly data to support that idea in mice too. So, independent of changes in energy balance, if you control for that, so the animals aren't gaining or losing weight, then access to food is clearly a really big driver of health. And you can dramatically improve an animal's health just by ensuring that they have access to the food at the appropriate circadian time of day. So
Mm.
I think if you had someone who really had quite poor metabolic health and you put them on calorie restricted diet with an appropriate macronutrient profile and it was mistimed, so it was during the first part of their biological nighttime, say, I think they would probably still experience health benefits if their baseline health and lifestyle were poor enough. But as you're saying, I think adding both the energy restriction and the appropriate time restriction is probably going to have some additional effect.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about sleep? So, there's a lot of different chronotypes out there. Some people are more night owls, some are morning larks, but generally speaking, humans are also, diurnal. We're not nocturnal creatures, although some people are slightly later with their chronotype, and some are slightly earlier. But generally speaking, we're not supposed to be nocturnal. Um, would um, would let's say having a deviant, so let's say unorthodox circadian rhythm to the natural human circadian rhythm, and would that also contribute to aging? So let's say we covered shift work, that clearly has a negative effect on this. But what about people who just maybe go to bed a few hours later? They go to bed at 1 a.m., 2 a.m. or something like that, and wake up 10 a.m.
I think if they're living in time with their own circadian clocks, then there wouldn't necessarily be negatives to that.
Hmm.
So you need to think about things relative to biological time as opposed to relative to social time, time on the clock on the wall. And when that's the case, you can have someone who, because of unusual clock genetics, could be at the far end of the night owl spectrum or the far end of the morning lark spectrum, and therefore be living several hours out of time with the rest of society. But if they're timing their activity and their nutrition and their light exposure well relative to their internal timing, then I think they'll benefit from that regardless. It's just that they've got unusual genetics. However, I should add that, particularly in the case of the extreme night owls, that is often a product of an unhealthy lifestyle. Because on average, the human circadian clock ticks at a pace that's slightly slower than 24 hours. Roughly 24 hours, 12 minutes. There's a tiny difference between the sexes. Females have marginally faster clocks for much of the life. If that's the case, then if you don't give your body strong time cues each day, in particular spending plenty of time in daylight, which is so bright compared to indoor lighting, but also has a different spectral composition, then your clock is likely to drift later because it's lower than 24 hours. So many people who appear to be night owls, at least superficially, they're not really night owls. It's just because they don't have particularly healthy lifestyles. But if we controlled for the actual clock and training exposures, namely light exposure, meal timing, medication timing, activity, and we had two sets of people, one group who were genetically very early birds and another who were genetically very late night owls, and there was therefore quite a big difference in their sleep-wake timing, I think they could both be equally healthy. There would be some changes or some differences between the groups just because you tend to find that gene variations tend to influence many different phenotypes at the same time. So I'm not saying that they would be the same in every other way. They would just have different sleep-wake timing. They would have different risk profiles, but I think that they could both be perfectly healthy.
Hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, it's like an impediment, but it all matters on the other lifestyles as well. Someone who's fit and healthy but has a shift work is probably healthier than a obese diabetic. diurnal human.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely. I think it's important for those people to understand that you might have a lifestyle that disrupts your clockwork. I don't want people to hear this conversation and think, oh, that means that I'm just going to be aging really quickly across the board. Because there are lots of things that you can do to minimize the repercussions on your health. And actually, in the case of shift work, one of the interesting things is that people's clocks don't seem to fully adapt to their shift schedules. And for the most part, their clock timing is surprisingly similar to their non-shift working counterparts. And so there's early work suggesting that if they can, for instance, maintain consistent meal timing across their shift cycle, and that would be meal timing that's probably largely confined to the daytime. So again, not dissimilar to non-shift workers, then they're likely to benefit because their internal alignment, so the alignment between different clocks in their system, is bound to be better. And Frank Shear published some lovely research on this a few years ago, showing that to be the case. He found that daytime restricted eating during experimental circadian misalignment, which was designed to mimic shift work, help people maintain better blood sugar control. And when they subsequently looked at a proxy of the timing of the master clock in the brain, it's because they had better alignment between master clock timing and their meal timing, because the master clock really hadn't budged that much. And then they published a follow-up study using the same participants, just different outcomes, showing that the same is true of various markers of cardiovascular risk. So you're not powerless. And if you have shift work or a lifestyle that disrupts your clock in some ways, then I would just still focus on trying to maintain regularity as much as is possible and recognize that outside of extreme scenarios like living offshore, so you see this in oil rig workers who can exclusively work night shifts and almost fully entrain to the night shift, outside of those very unusual contexts, for the most part, that probably actually involves trying to maintain relatively similar lifestyle timing to non-shift workers outside of your working hours.
what would melatonin supplementation be something that, let's say, obviously it can help with sleep, but does melatonin supplementation somehow artificially create bigger fluctuations in the circadian hormones that decline with age? Like, so can you like basically mimic a natural circadian fluctuation with melatonin supplementation?
I think that some of these exposures, chronobiotic, so agents that can modify clock parameters, whether that's the amplitude or the phase, I think there's evidence that they can help prevent some of those or reverse some of those age-related changes in rhythms. That's been shown for meal timing in some model organisms. Regarding melatonin in humans specifically, it's a really good question. And I don't think it's been very well studied. I haven't looked at that literature recently. The last time that I looked at it properly, there wasn't much evidence of that. Part of the problem here is just that it's really expensive to profile someone's hormones across the day and do so in a comprehensive way, because you're basically talking about doing many different blood draws throughout the day and looking at a large array of different hormones. So
Mhm.
rather than doing that, a lot of people, they might do that with certain hormones. So a classic example would be something with a high amplitude rhythm like cortisol, or they might just try to standardize the time of day at which they're taking tests and then make some extrapolations based on that. So the short answer is that I don't know. My guess is that we would see some improvements in some of those diurnal rhythms. I say diurnal rhythms because often people speak about circadian rhythms, and when I'm speaking loosely, I might also do this myself at times. To show a true circadian rhythm, you need a certain type of experimental paradigm. Whereas just to show a 24-hour rhythm, that doesn't show that something is driven by the circadian clock, because it could be a function of the fact that your behavioral cycle entails predictable fluctuations across the 24-hour day. So it could just be a product of when you're eating, when you're active, and so on, rather than being driven by the clock itself. So I would think that there would be a positive effect on some of those rhythm amplitudes in certain other hormones. You could argue that we definitely see that with the sleep-wake cycle, just because, particularly in older people, certain forms of melatonin can be helpful for sleep. And actually, circadian time-released version is approved for treatment of sleep maintenance insomnia in elderly individuals specifically. And so it could be that melatonin is improving clock function directly because it's this internal signal of darkness that's acting on its receptors throughout the body, and then that's affecting the clocks of those cells in different tissues. But it could also be a product of the fact that by improving sleep, people are making better lifestyle choices. Maybe they have a bit more energy, they're more likely to engage in physical activity, and so on. And then downstream of that, we're seeing some change in clock function. So it's speculation, but my guess is that we would see some positive effects. And of course, this ties back into the idea that there could be things that we can do to improve clock function using pharmaceuticals or nutraceuticals. And there really hasn't been much research on this. So if you take the example of melatonin, there's not any good lifespan research on it. And there should be. It's a really, really good candidate
Mhm.
because, as you know really well, Siim, melatonin is a very, very safe substance. And you don't seem to see the same type of tolerance and withdrawal effects that you see with many other medications. It's not like taking exogenous testosterone, where you basically very quickly shut down your own internal production of testosterone. You don't get that with melatonin. You don't take melatonin and then shut down your body's own synthesis of it. Not that we can tell, at least. And given some of its other benefits outside of the circadian system in terms of its antioxidant effects in different tissue compartments and so on, I think it's a really interesting candidate. But I don't know if it's been put forward to the ITP. Not that I personally put much stock in the ITP, I certainly don't. But it would be a really intriguing substance to look at. And then there are some other so-called clock-enhancing small molecules that people are starting to explore. There's really not much research on this. Joe Takahashi was on a paper in which the authors did a untargeted chemical screen to try and identify substances that could improve the molecular clock function of individual cells. And then they took the best candidate, which was nobiletin, which is a flavonoid that you find in citrus peel in particular. So you get lots of it in things like the skin of a grapefruit. They took that and then they gave it to mice, and they found that, consistent with their research on the cells, the mice had improved clock function as they got older. And in conjunction with that, dramatic improvements in various different markers of metabolic health in particular. So if they fed them a high-fat diet, then it could improve things like the amount of fat in the liver, blood sugar control, body weight, and so on. And some of that seemed to be driven by improved clock function when the mice were active, when they were resting, and so on. And interestingly, they did an experiment where they genetically knocked down part of the molecular clock, and that largely nullified the positive effects of the nobiletin, suggesting that the benefits driven by its effects on the circadian clock itself. And so I think we're going to see more work trying to identify some of those clock enhancing molecules. But of the different candidates that we know about, you could argue that melatonin is one already. And so
Yeah.
people are more and more open to the idea that it could be good for lots of different things. But yeah, it definitely should be tested.
Yeah. With age, you see a quite substantial decrease in melatonin starting already after puberty. Now that the drop after puberty is natural to becoming an adult, but you see even greater decrease as well when you reach the age of 80, etc. So would because let's say you can block out all the blue light, right? You can live a very natural circadian rhythm that you literally just go to bed after the sun sets, etc. But your body still wouldn't produce nearly as much melatonin as it did even 10, 20, 30 years ago. So would taking melatonin as a supplement for the elderly be, I guess, good for longevity in a sense that you're raising melatonin, although with a supplement, you're raising the melatonin which your body isn't producing anyway in sufficient quantities at that age.
Yeah, sure. So another form of HRT, melatonin replacement
Right.
therapy. It makes sense in some ways. One thing I would add is that we should consider what the reduced melatonin synthesis is downstream of.
Hmm.
And I don't know how much this would affect melatonin synthesis, but just as an example of a relevant age related change, if you've got clouding of the lens of the eye, as a lot of elderly people experience, then that will influence circadian function and sleep. And it, a good example of this that I'm really interested in that no one seems to point out is the Lancet Commission every few years publishes their statement about dementia and the lay of the land, what we know about how to prevent it, and so on. What are the risk factors? And they recently added some risk factors. And one of the risk factors that isn't in there because they don't think the evidence is strong enough is sleep disruption or circadian sleep disruption, which I think is ridiculous because it's clearly a massive contributor in many ways. It's just the way they look at the assessment and not understanding the interactions between different things. Within their commission document, they mention untreated vision loss as a contributor to dementia risk, which I agree with, of course. But what they don't recognize is that if you treat, for example, macular degeneration through appropriate corrective surgery, then you see big improvements in circadian rhythmicity and sleep because you've got more photons reaching the photoreceptors at the back of the eye. And so it's not the vision loss per se, I don't think, that's doing most of the heavy lifting. I think it's the fact that by treating that particular condition, you have better function of the circadian system and better sleep in response to that, which then is having positive effects on risk of this age-related disease, namely dementia. So I would just question what is
Hmm.
upstream of the loss of melatonin synthesis. And in that particular example, that could be a contributor, I imagine. I don't know if it's actually been shown. I haven't looked for that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, so
But
the loss of vision is what reduces the circadian signaling into the brain then.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So you've got a weaker signal going to the SCN. And so by correcting vision, you're actually also correcting the input to the SCN and then having all sorts of downstream positive effects on the clock at large and therefore biology at large and various different aging related processes. But going back to your idea of melatonin replacement therapy, let's call it that. I think we might just coin that. I'm sure someone's already done it in the literature, but I think it's an interesting idea. Again, I don't want to be too gung ho and say that people should be doing this because melatonin use for the relatively long term has been quite well studied, but we're speaking about 2 or 3 years for the most part. And this is actually true of young people too. So it has been studied for multiple years in young people with certain chronic health conditions and been found to be apparently safe without any untoward effects on their maturation, their physical and cognitive development, and so on. So I wouldn't say past a certain age, you should be taking melatonin for the rest of your life. But might that be beneficial for some people? It wouldn't surprise me at all. And how does that look in terms of safety? We don't know. It's something that's worth investigating. And then we should also bear in mind something that I don't think we've spelled out, and that is melatonin's been being studied for all sorts of use cases, which again, Siim, I know you will have discussed previously, but we know, for instance, that in certain women, so women past a specific age, melatonin seems to be good for their bones and for their body composition in general. It's being studied in PCOS. as a way of improving ovarian function, which is probably in part through improved metabolic regulation. It's being studied in diabetes and prediabetes, where it's similar properties, and the list goes on. And so it seems to be good for many indications that people will probably have listed as being off-label indications, because it's not like people were first studying melatonin ingestion as a way of improving PCOS. It's just that it likely actually can be good for some of those people by way of improving sleep and circadian function and redox regulation and so on. So more research is needed, of course, but could melatonin use for many years late in life benefit lots of people? I'm very open to that idea. It raises other questions too, like how should someone's dose change over time? So if we're seeing an age-related loss of average melatonin levels, then should someone's melatonin dose be scaled to age someone? So maybe in someone's 60s, they're taking a lower dose than what they're taking in their 80s. There are all sorts of questions that ensue.
Yeah, there's some people taking 100, 200 milligrams melatonin every night, and
Yeah.
yeah, like literally 200 times more, and,
Oh, wow.
they've been taking it for a long time, and apparently, I mean, yeah, like it goes to show the safety of melatonin that it doesn't even have any side effects at that doses
Yeah.
for
Well,
a long period
I,
of time.
I would suspect that heroic dose like that, you've probably got some receptor downregulation. I mean, it reminds me of people who, there are anecdotes of people taking quite large doses, so certainly strongly psychedelic doses of LSD every day. I
Mhm.
think Amanda Fielding, she recently passed away, bless her, but she took probably 200 odd micrograms of LSD day in, day out for quite a long time. And initially, that would produce a truly heroic trip of probably 12 to 14 hours for someone. But when they've been taking that for several days consecutively, there's probably such receptor downregulation that it's barely psychedelic by that point. And so, if we're talking about someone's taking 200 milligrams of melatonin in the long term, then I would think that at those types of levels, there is some downregulation. But like you say, it really does highlight the safety of it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think for those doses you need to have the suppository, so you're not going to be able to. I mean, you could take it orally as well, but oral melatonin has like only 10% bioavailability, if I'm not mistaken. That it's not really bioavailable orally as well.
I think it's more bioavailable than that, but it's certainly metabolized very quickly. At those types of high doses, though, the pharmacokinetics be very different. So whereas the half-life of regular melatonin for young healthy people is probably to the tune of 45 minutes or so, a reasonable dose. At 200 milligrams, it would certainly be substantially longer than that. But when I spoke about scaling dose to age, I certainly wasn't envisioning 90-year-olds taking 200 milligrams a day. I was thinking something more like maybe starting with like 100 micrograms and then over time possibly scaling up to 300 micrograms, something slightly more conservative. And those doses are substantially lower than the doses, the pharmacological doses that are used clinically to treat certain problems. So for circadian rhythm and sleep disturbances, the doses that are often used are probably anywhere between 300 micrograms and 5 milligrams, typically, if you look at many of those studies. For indications like PCOS and so on, often the doses are more like 5 to 10 milligrams, so a bit higher. But if we're speaking about the general population and melatonin replacement therapy, then the amount that will be needed to mimic endogenous levels being produced by a young adult is really very small. We're talking about tens of micrograms, not hundreds of micrograms. And so I wouldn't necessarily see a need for those types of pharmacological doses if
Mm,
the goal is replacement.
gotcha. Um, what about the morning then? So we also see a decline in cortisol, and you know, arguably one way you could raise cortisol is with caffeine or something like that. Blue light exposure, or also let's say the sunlight exposure in the morning also increases cortisol. So what are things people can do in the morning to, let's say, anchor their circadian rhythm into the morning?
So I probably wouldn't think about this in terms of specific hormones. I'd think about it more in terms of the system at large. And I think many of the behaviors that I put forward are ones that we've discussed on previous podcasts. But something to point out is just that there's variation between people in their clocks. And this is very relevant as people get older. From the end of adolescence, so roughly 19 years for females and 21 for males, to the grave, people tend to get earlier and earlier. And what that means for people who are in their 70s and 80s is often that their sleep wake cycles are really very early. And so they don't want to get any earlier. And therefore, recommending that they get lots of bright light as soon as they wake up in the morning is probably going to push them further in that direction they don't want to go.
Mm.
So we need to bear that in mind. I think more in terms of what do you want to do with your clock? Are you happy with the timing of it? Do you want to set it earlier because at the moment you're waking up to an alarm clock in the morning for work and you're therefore consistently restricting your sleep during the working week? And if that's the case, then you focus on time cues that are going to anchor it earlier in the day, which would be bright light exposure within 2 hours of waking, physical activity relatively early in the day, certainly not too close to bedtime, no later than maybe 4 hours before bedtime for high volume and or high low training of any variety, minimizing exposure to bright light and short wavelength rich light in the 3 hours before bed, ensuring that you finish your final meal of the day at least 3 hours before bed. All of those things are going to help set someone relatively early, and then also addressing any stimulants or medications that could affect someone's sleep and clock function as well. So typically that would just be focusing on caffeine. And for someone that's trying to shift earlier, then they might want to cap their caffeine intake at a lower total amount and finish it earlier in the day too. So whereas for most people, I'd say on average, finish it at least 9 hours before bedtime, provided that your intake is no higher than about 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight per day. For those people, we might say, I want you to consume more of your caffeine at least 12 hours before bedtime. Small amounts of decaf products after that time might be permissible. Whereas for someone who's trying to shift later, actually, many of the things that I just recommended, not caffeine, but would be somewhat reversed. So those people are trying to get lots of bright light exposure late in the day, not immediately before bed, but in their late biological afternoon or early biological evening, being physically active a little bit later in the day and making sure that they're eating until maybe up to 3 hours before bed and not finishing earlier than that. And that's going to help ensure that they don't drift too early as they get older. So I realize I haven't answered your question directly there, but I would really focus on the system as a whole as opposed to any one hormone. And I think it's also an instance where nowadays a lot of people are really interested in trying to push markers in certain directions. I'm going to take this supplement to play with my cortisol, or I haven't got the morning spike in testosterone synthesis that I'd like to see. So I'm going to start taking ashwagandha, whatever it might be. And actually, I think, again, we've got to ask what's upstream of all of that. And for the most part, when you work on the foundations of a healthy lifestyle, and that includes high amplitude, well-timed time cues. So plenty of physical activity during the day, rest at night, confining your meals to a 12-hour window or less each day, and making sure that you get plenty of time outdoors in daylight, at least an hour each day, and keeping your nights dark. All of those things are going to help with the rhythms of many different hormones. And for the most part, we tend to push them in the right directions.
Mm, gotcha. How does sunlight, itself, obviously it affects your circadian rhythms with the light exposure, but is there any effect from like the UV and infrared radiation itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, what are you referring to there specifically when you say are there any effects? What on
The
what
circadian
specific?
clocks, infrared does have some ATP producing effects. It supports mitochondrial function.
Yeah,
So people who get more sunlight, maybe they have, let's say, better mitochondrial health and
yeah,
better clock function because of that.
yeah. It's an interesting idea, and I know that people are increasingly focusing on this. Some of this was spawned by a lot of the early work on photobiomodulation, and now people are recognizing previously unappreciated roles of different wavelengths of light on all sorts of different outcomes, whether it's infrared light and mitochondrial function or various other wavelengths of light and other outcomes. And I haven't spent much time looking at that body of research recently. I was interested in the photobiomodulation stuff probably 8 or 9 years ago, and also how it interfaces with some other interventions too, like combining photobiomodulation with methylene blue because of some speculated additive effect on mitochondrial function. But then, could any improvements in mitochondrial function influence the circadian clock in turn? I don't know. And I think right now it would be very speculative to say, well, you should focus on these wavelengths at these times in order to produce these processes, which in turn are going to have these effects on the circadian system. And again, I would zoom back out and focus on the big picture. But could there be some effects of things like infrared light and near infrared light? Yeah, I think so. And we're already seeing some of those effects on everything from responses to food intake, so changes in blood sugar, for instance, based on patterns of light exposure, to endothelial function and in turn blood pressure, and then mitochondrial function, which is the darling of many people in the longevity world at the moment. So yeah, it's a good question. And the short answer is I'm not sure.
Mm, gotcha. I guess it's good to get sun exposure to regulate your circadian rhythm in the morning and daytime as
Yeah,
well.
I think the other point to make is people will often come across things like, oh, this specific wavelength of light affects mitochondrial function. So I'm going to try and game the system and I'm going to get a photobiomodulation device in order to improve my mitochondrial function. What is sometimes lost along the way is the fact that if you get full spectrum exposure from sunlight, from being outside, there are so many other benefits that come with that. So if you're outdoors and you're in daylight, particularly if you're in nature at the same time and you're not looking at a screen, you're not listening to a podcast, whatever, you're letting your mind wander, there are all sorts of other benefits that come with that. And so I would rather personally suggest that someone go and take a walk in the park or the forest, recognizing that they're getting a bunch of other additional health promoting exposure at the same time than using a device with very specific parameters. Not only is it more cost effective, I actually think that it will lead to better health outcomes that way.
Mm, yeah, gotcha. Um, Maybe we can start, let's say, wrapping up. But what are then the most important things people need to do to, let's say, keep their circadian clocks working well during aging?
Yeah. So if we had to try and boil it down, then I would say regarding light exposure, spend at least an hour outdoors in daylight and don't get burned. Reduce your exposure to bright overhead light, specifically in the 3 hours or so before bed. at that time of day, I would encourage people to keep their lighting romantic, should be relatively low in the environment. The color tones should be quite warm. So buying some lamps with amber lights and having those around your house is a really good option for a lot of people. In terms of meal timing, I would say you probably want to wait at least an hour after your natural wake up time before your first calories. Maybe apart from the tiny amount of energy that's in something like a cup of coffee or tea, if it's black coffee or black tea or green tea, whatever. And then finish your final meal or your final calorie intake at least 3 hours before bed. I think for most people, a 6 to 12 hour eating window is going to work well. I favor the low end of that range. If you don't have any contraindications like a history of eating disorders or a history of low energy availability and reproductive dysfunction related to that. But I favor the low end of that range if you're trying to lose weight or you're prone to weight gain, and the upper end of the range if you're trying to put on some fat-free mass, say, or if you're very physically active and you have quite high energy needs. And then in terms of physical activity, I think aiming to get at least 8,000 steps a day is a good target for a lot of people, but that typically involves working your way up to it as opposed to jumping from 3,000 steps to 8,000 steps. It's not going to be sustainable for many people. And then in terms of strenuous activity, finishing that at least 4 hours before bedtime is going to give your body enough time to wind down from the stress that's inherent to that exposure. And then if you can only work out early in the day, and I mean within a couple of hours of waking, I would give yourself longer to warm up because your core body temperature is still quite low at that time. And that means that your exercise performance is going to be lower. It also means that your risk of injury might be marginally higher. It's not just related to core body temperature. There are some other things at play, but give yourself a little bit more time to warm up in the morning, but your clocks will adapt because they anticipate what you're used to doing. So if you're used to working out before work in the morning, then the clocks in your skeletal muscles and your bones and so on will learn to anticipate the timing of that activity. So I think those would be the big picture ones. The other things I would say are, if you're taking a medication, then speak with your doctor about whether there's a best time for the medication. We know that that's true for some medications already. So there's quite a lot of work, for example, looking at various different arthritis medications, showing that they tend to be best when taken in the evening. There's a bit of evidence suggesting that statins are best taken late in the day too, because they target the rate limiting enzyme cholesterol synthesis, which tends to have a peak late in the day. And there are several other medications that have quite well characterized time of day windows for optimal responses. And that's certainly true of some cancer drugs. They were the best studied early on. But I do think that timing has many implications for medicine at large. And so as we better understand the best times of day at which to take drugs, maybe people can end up taking lower doses and having fewer side effects as well. So I think those would be the big picture items. The recommendations I just gave are very generic. And so if you are in that group of people, like the shift workers, experiencing lots of circadian disruption on a regular basis, then the recommendations would change a little bit. But I think for the masses, those will hold relatively well. And yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it otherwise. In terms of shameless self-promotion, if people are interested in finding more of my work online, then on YouTube, I'm at Greg Potter PhD, and I've got a podcast which is called Reason and Wellbeing, and you featured on there recently, Siim, which was fun. And then my handle on social media is also at Greg Potter PhD. So if you've got any questions that relate to this, then do feel free to reach out.
Yeah, that's we'll put the links in the show notes. And yeah, it was great to talk with you.
Thanks, Siim.